Thank you. Good morning, I'm Billy, I'm an alcoholic. My sobriety date's January the 5th of 1990. My home group is a Tell It Like It Is group in Palm Beach Gardens, Florida. I'll start off by saying, not judging, I said my name's Billy, and I did not say my last name, not because I don't believe what Dr. Bob wrote, his quote, that being too anonymous is as bad, it's not being anonymous. I said my name is Billy and not my last name because I'm being recorded. And you see, that is why the group conscience of AA as a whole, if you read the guidelines for conventions at speakers at conventions, is if you're being recorded, not to say your last name. So in any other situation, I have no problem saying my last name. I'm just trying to be one of many by not saying my last name here, and also knowing that, again, going back to the not judging, I know there's at least 3 people in here who whatever I say is going to go up on YouTube, and you're not going to ask me my permission before you post it there. And then if I say my last name, then there's another 3 of you in the room who are going to send me an email saying you said your last name and it's on YouTube. So I'm just trying to avoid all those problems early. I was at a little bit of a great meeting last night, and I'm not talking about the big one. That was great too. But I just want to talk about out my hotel so that we can get kind of out of this is not a session on how to be the AA police, okay? And I couldn't be more honored, and I have the lights in my eyes, but I couldn't be more honored because I know Gail and Harmon used to do this. And God, rest Harmon's soul and all the service and work he did for AA. But I'm going to try to stay away from the AA police mode of that you all came here to be deputized to go back and fix the rest of AA. That is not the purpose of this session. And so what I would want to start off with is saying that, and I saw one, I saw a guy over there. But anyway, the hotel that I was at, there was a meeting going on, and there were people smoking cigars out there, and I went outside. And I just want to recognize the beauty of AA at its purest form. No step shades, no perfect readers, no laminated perfect 9-step promises, no GSR report. There was probably a share or 2 that would drive a few of you crazy. I definitely saw a person that took a little bit of liberty with the time, apparently. But at its very nature, AA is beautiful. At its very nature. And sometimes beauty is in the eye of the beholder. And never has that statement applied to anything more than Alcoholics Anonymous. That what your beauty is might not be what my beauty is. And, when you look at the 12 traditions, which for me, I've said it many times before, the steps are our message, the traditions protect our message, and the concepts perpetuate our message. To me, I can keep it that simple. The traditions, call them guardrails, call them speed bumps. I kind of find it very funny that both of those were kind of created for drunks like us, guardrails and speed bumps, but they apply to the traditions perfectly. When you talk about certain traditions that get a little specific, and I'll get to the 10th in a little bit, sometimes you come to a stop sign and it's just a stop sign. Sometimes you come to a stop sign and there's flashing red lights around the edge of it. Is there a difference between those 2 stop signs? No. You have to stop at both of them. The one with the lights flashing around the edges is to warn you that in this location, there's a lot of accidents. Just an early warning. Hey, it's the same stop sign, but you should know this place is notoriously dangerous. No different than the 10th tradition saying what it does about outside issues, and then saying religion, politics, alcohol reform. Just giving you a little heads up. At the end of the day, I'll say a couple of things to start with about the traditions, in that they're all about ego. They're all about our ego, my ego, your ego. They're not about regulation. They're basically about that if you are a real alcoholic, the kind described in the big book, that people like us are not wired the same as other people. And there's certain things that spiritually we can't handle that will kill us. So for me, yes, you could write a book and you could break your anonymity, but I'm not wired to be famous for being sober in the outside world. I cannot have fame based on sobriety. And, the ego portion of it is to make sure that we take care of two things. And I know there's going to be some people here who disagree with me, and that's okay. But it's basically to take care of two things, those 12 principles. The second one, and lowest on order, is me. To keep me out of trouble. To keep my ego in check. But that is long after taking care of AA. I am not more important than AA. AA is more important than me or anybody else, and that is the beauty of the first tradition. Now, if you're familiar, and I'm sure some of you are, more than me, but some of you could probably quote the book better than me. But, Bill gave a talk in the 50s, and he talked about when these traditions were created. And he said one of the reasons that they were created was that you could kind of debate. I loved, when Peter was talking about big book thumpers and other people, and we could all go outside and split hairs about how we work the 12 steps or how we take people through the big book or who is more right than. We could all do that. I think we could all agree, though, that 12 step basically has three parts, having had a spiritual experience, carrying this message, practicing these principles. And Bill gave this talk in the 1950s and said one of the reasons that the traditions were created is that they noticed that people were doing a better job of practicing these principles in all their affairs in everywhere except one place, the very organization that saved their life. This new thing that started in 1935 after alcoholics dying for thousands of years, and the worst place they were practicing these principles was inside Alcoholics Anonymous. And that's, one of the reasons the traditions were created. Now, I just want to warn everybody, sometimes, and, the real traditions, please get mad at me when I say this. So I'll apologize ahead of time. Sometimes the reaction to a so-called traditions violation, the behavior is so horrible that anything you're trying to point out is worthless. That your actions are so loud they can't hear you. And sometimes we don't realize that. Sometimes the worst behavior is by someone that's dressed like I am today. Sometimes the behavior doesn't have to be, what I try to say is, if you don't have time to spend time with the person, then why are you saying something? Now, I have a couple of pamphlets in front of me, so I want to just, before I give you a bunch of my experience, which people will later judge as opinion, I want to share some experience for those of you that may be new. Is number one, and I stole this from Don P., back in the so-called big book revolution, let's call it that, if you go to the right, and I love the big book, but if you go to the right big book gathering, you might think you're watching training on Navy SEAL Hell Week, right? Like, that's like what it seems like. Like, this is the real AA and the only AA, and so be it. Everybody is entitled to practice as they may. But one of the things that Don P. said in the early 90s was the downside of this big book revolution might be that we have too many First Legacy only alcoholics roaming around AA with no knowledge of the other 24 principles. That a First Legacy only big book thumper is just as dangerous as the people they complain about that aren't coming out of the big book. That it's a package deal, it's a triangle. And I'm sure, again, I'll just go to the people in this audience that I'm sure, like me, you've ran into someone outside a meeting, inside a meeting, on a porch, in a parking lot. It's the person you know. It's not the person who just burst into AA for the first time. It's the person who you get, it bothers you how many times they've come back to AA. Just be honest. Like, you look across the room and the chairperson says, is anyone new here today? And they raise their hand again and you're saying in your head, I can't believe it. Like, how could their life get any worse and they're new again? But I bring that type of individual up because when you talk to that person in the parking lot and they inform you that they've been in AA for 5 years and have not been able to get any time together, that I'm sure some of you will share with me after the meeting that you've had this conversation with them, and that after you're done with that conversation, you know that they have done everything except AA. Like, they said they were in AA for 5 years, but they've done everything except AA. And that's a good part to get to, because then you know what you need to do, but I'm going to bring that into light with the traditions. Honestly, without reading AA Comes of Age, it's very difficult, almost impossible, to grasp our traditions. You have to have read AA Comes of Age. How do you work the steps without being going through the big book of the 12 and 12? And I'm not going to debate with anyone after the meeting about the 12 and 12 or what. I'm just giving it as an example. But you can understand the traditions without understanding and reading AA Comes of Age. The worst advertising job in the history of Alcoholics Anonymous is that AA Comes of Age is a success story. It's actually the exact opposite. AA Comes of Age is a documentation of colossal failures that started to happen after Mother's Day of 1935 when perfection happened. But unfortunately, after that meeting in that gatehouse not too far from where I'm standing right now, humans got involved. And in our situation, particularly alcoholic variety of humans. And so by the time 1946 came around, believe it or not, we had done everything we could to destroy AA. The big book gets written in 1939. It goes on fire probably in the late, 1942, 43 after the Saturday Evening Post article. But there were lots of problems, and I'm not here to document those problems, but there were lots of problems. Again, sometimes if you go to a big book retreat, it's like anything that happened after this book has been published has been perfect. We have been living in the fellowship of the Spirit and everything has been great. That is not true. The human ego invaded Alcoholics Anonymous. Just think about this. In 1946, you're minding your own business at whatever outpost of AA you have. You're bothering no one, but you are the king or queen of your AA group. In 1946, 7 years was like having 80 years today, okay? If you had 7 years in 1946, you were an absolute old-timer. So those people who had 7 and 6 and 8 and 10 years, they were not happy about this guy in New York that wrote this set of principles that all of a sudden was going to tell you no membership rules. That all of a sudden was going to tell you you don't get to decide who's in and out of AA. So they weren't always embraced. AA Comes of Age is a collection of the biggest mistakes we've made boiled down into 12 buckets. Those are our 12 traditions. All the mistakes we made the first, call it 11 years, 10 years. If you've follow what Don P. used to say is, people say, how do I get the traditions in my group or area? How do I get people to do this? You're not going to get people to do anything in AA, first of all. So just put that off to the side, okay? Ask somebody tonight that's wearing a committee badge, or ask somebody over at Dr. Bob's house who's wearing some kind of thing like they're, know what they're doing, and ask them how it's been going dealing with us all day, okay? Ask them how it's been going trying to, put a tent around the AA community circus. It's a difficult job on any day. But Don said, don't take people through the big book if they don't agree up front that they're going to agree to go through the traditions as well. Like, that's it. I have a new person, they want to go through the book, that's great. Are you willing to go to any lengths? Great. Let's define any lengths. You need to go through the traditions after we go through the big book, or parallel. I'm not going to tell people exactly what to do. But sending people out with First Legacy only recovery is just making them a member of the recovery community, not of the Spiritual Society of Alcoholics Anonymous. You have to have some basic experience with the traditions. You don't have to be an expert, but at least you're not going to be doing damage. These 3 pamphlets, if you're new, I'm just going to call them out. The 12 Traditions Illustrated is amazing. I might even argue better than the 12 and 12. The AA group pamphlet, incredible. And Problems Other Than Alcohol. And in today's world, people say, can the traditions still apply in 2023? They can, and they must. They have to. But what I would share with you is enforcement does not work. Embracing works. No different than the big book and the program of recovery. You could try to fit a big book down someone's throat, step on them, try to make them swallow it, and get them to get sober all you want. We know it doesn't work. It's only when a person gets that they've been beaten till they can take no more, that usually every AA member has to make the worst decision they've ever had to make in their entire life, especially if you've been in and out of AA a lot. You're going to have to go over to the person you hate the most in AA, and you've hated them for years, and they're the overly passionate, super happy, love AA, rah, 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 and you're going to have to come to the same point that I came, which is, I need to ask you for help. Somehow what you're doing is working, and what I'm doing is not working. Same with the traditions. You can tell people a million times, or you can show people. Now, show is a problem, because AA is very different today than it was back in 1935, 1950, even 1985, 1995. I told you that meeting I went to last night was outstanding. And not perfect by any means. And I say that with the highest compliment. However, when you ask someone to speak at a convention or a large speaker meeting that a lot of newcomers are coming to, I didn't bring any of the pamphlets that existed before our pamphlets that they sell at the Akron in the group, but there's some of those pamphlets that I love. One of the ones that I love talks about the important responsibility of the meeting chairperson in picking the speakers. It's an immense responsibility. In today's AA, at conventions and roundups and other big speaker meetings, yes, there is more of a responsibility for somebody on this side of the podium than on that side of the audience. There's no doubt about it, and I have no problem saying that. Because we have a duty to the newcomer who is sitting out in the audience. If the message that somebody wants to bring is other than that of Alcoholics Anonymous, they have no business being behind the podium at a convention. Zero. I'm sorry. I know when it's not that message. The newcomer does not. If somebody is using this podium at a convention or a conference or a roundup or anything else to sell something, they have no business being a speaker at an AA convention. They can be an AA member all they want. But I don't need a newcomer outside thinking they have to buy something to get sober. Peter said it last night, for fun and for free. I don't have anything to sell to them today. But the responsibility to the newcomer, and this is why when people say, don't worry, Billy, God will take care of AA. We don't have to worry about it. We don't need the AA police. We don't even need the traditions. God will take care of AA. Even as a believer, I don't believe that. I believe God takes care of us. We have a responsibility to take care of AA. That's our responsibility. Unless your ego is completely out of whack and you think, you know what? God just didn't like the Washingtonians. God hated the Washingtonians. That's why they went away. No. They went away because of outside issues. They went away because of a chronic overdependence on charismatic speakers. They went away because of the human ego. So are we different? Should my ego be that out of whack where I'm like, God just loves AA that much. We can do whatever we want. I'm not sure I believe that. I don't believe in the super AA police, but I don't think we should be ashamed of sticking up for AA. And in today's world, like I said, there's a bunch of issues out there, and I'm going to go through some of the high ones. You can't go through all 12 traditions properly in an hour. But I will tell you this. I know that there's people here who attend Zoom meetings. That's awesome. I attend Zoom meetings. I know that AA is like a sponsee. Sometimes it needs a pat on the back. Sometimes it needs a kick in the ass. AA failed the people it serves technology-wise. When I say AA, I mean everybody. I mean intergroups, districts, areas, general service. All old people fear of technology. I could give example after example after example. I don't have time this morning, but it's true. In 2009, I was at an AAWS meeting, and somebody asked me if I was doing work email. And I was like, no, I'm taking notes. Like, that's what we do where I work. Like, we take notes on an iPad. It's called an iPad. But no, we failed. And COVID kicked us in the ass. And now we've harnessed that technology, which is awesome. I mean, it's incredible. However, we have one home group in AA. It doesn't matter if it's online or in person. One home group. I hear people now say, my name's Billy, I'm an alcoholic, this is my Zoom home group. So, in the AA group pamphlet, I can't find a Zoom home group. I don't even find reference to an in-person home group. I just find reference to a home group. Now, you can go to as many meetings as you want, that's awesome. But we have to be careful with the over-proliferation of meetings. It was already happening in person, now online. And, if you're a sponsor, I would just suggest that, in today's world, what groups you're sending your sponsees to online. Because there's a lot of dangerous stuff out there. I'm not the AA police. But when a woman from the other side of the country calls me, basically in tears, says, Billy, I sent my sponsor to this women's meeting online, and they were having discussion, and there was some traumatic things in life that got brought up, and a speaker messaged her in the chat to sell her trauma workbook. And this sponsee just called me and was just about to pay this person $7,000. I just had to call you and find out, is this okay? Should this be happening? That makes me sad more than angry. And I don't take anybody's livelihood away from them. But we keep it out of AA. AA is for fun and for free. We affiliate with nothing. The second tradition, it's hard for people to grasp only because it means that I don't matter. The group matters. The group knows better than me, no matter what. Doesn't matter what the topic. Sometimes the group knows better than the old-timer. Sometimes the group knows better than the newcomer. But the group, whatever group that is, knows better if it's an informed group conscience. I want to, from a 2023 angle, talk about Tradition 3. Because it's controversial, right? I might as well throw a grenade in the middle of the audience. Why would I talk about Tradition 3 in this big a crowd? And a lot of difficulty in AA meetings sometimes comes from this. And what I want to stress is the long form of Tradition 3 is very clear. We don't need to argue about a desire to stop drinking. If you're in love with the short form of Tradition 3, let me say this. The last paragraph in the narrative of Tradition 3 is very clear. It doesn't say anyone is an AA member when they say they are. It says any alcoholic is a member of AA when they say they are. And we're talking about an alcoholic with a desire to stop drinking. I don't talk about this tradition from a point of view of killing people or throwing people out of AA. That has no place in AA. Bill W. felt that the newcomer deserves all the time and patience they deserve to figure out if they belong here. And that's their decision. And we should honor that. But we should not enable their death. That is for certain. I know that during COVID, again, there was a big online, everybody went to it. It broke my heart, but everybody did. I went to it. I needed to see what this gentleman was going to see. And there he did with thousands of people online in this big thing called the New Doctor's Opinion. Said gambling, codependency, food, drugs, alcohol, all the same thing. That is just dangerous. The AA group pamphlet on page 18, I think, is misquoted a lot. It says the primary purpose of any AA group is to carry the AA message to alcoholics. The experience with alcoholics is one thing all AA members have in common. It is misleading to hint or give the impression that AA solves other problems or knows what to do about drug addiction. So Matt, they talk about drug addiction there, not drug use. For a reason. We going to throw people out of AA who've done other things or have other problems? Come on. Take an honest look around you the next time you're in an AA meeting. We are not like we're definitely not the Oxford group for sure today, right? No, we know that, right? There's no absolutes, anything. But drug addiction. Why have we anointed ourselves if we can't solve? Because I'm a guy who's sat across from somebody. This is a real life story. Billy, yesterday I forged my wife's signature on a second mortgage application because I owe my bookie $60,000 and I can't stop gambling. True story. 8 years sober. I admit all the time there is no doubt that the 12 steps of AA, if you are an alcoholic, will help with your other problems. No doubt about it. Might help with your money problems, your food problems, your gambling problems, your drug problems. It might help. The book says that. But it doesn't guarantee it. So I had to tell this person who's like 7 or 8 years sober, they have to go to GA. I'm not an expert on not gambling. And apparently neither is their sponsor that's telling them they only need to go to AA. They need to go get help. And we need to stop talking bad about other fellowships in Alcoholics Anonymous. I know I'm in Akron right now. I couldn't be more thankful to the Akron Intergroup, the Founders Day Committee, the Dr. Bob's Foundation. I could not be more thankful to all of that for your role in keeping AA here. I know we're the mothership. I know in 1935 those two men met. But if you read the big book and all the black part, the foreword to the second edition talks about Dr. Bob trying spiritual means for a while, and it did not work. So people out there who are telling people, oh, I have the solution in steps 2 to 12, it doesn't matter what your first step problem is, that's not what our big book says. Our big book says that only after Dr. Bob had the Me Too moment with Bill W. and identified did he have the hopelessness to then embrace this program. I don't care if you're an alcoholic and anything else. I don't even get mad at people. You know, I know there are those people in the crowd, but, you know, if there's anybody from Chicago here out of memory for him, I go with the John G. rule. You know, John G. would say all the time, you know, when people got mad about how people introduced themselves, you know. He'd say, Billy, I don't believe anything a newcomer says for a year. Why are you getting mad at how they introduce themselves? Like, I don't believe anything they tell me. Nothing. I don't believe they tell me where they work, where they live. I don't believe anything. He's like, why are you getting so mad? And so I want people to introduce themselves as an alcoholic because I don't want anyone to think there's any other requirements. But I get John's point. We don't publicly humiliate people. We don't say things to people flippantly unless we're willing to spend the time to go through the book with them and explain things to them. But, you know, it's really sad when people who have never been to another fellowship start saying ridiculous, tragic stuff in AA meetings. Oh, that fellowship has no solution. Really? I have some bad news for everyone at Founders Day this weekend. I know how we are the passionate, over-the-top AA members here, right? In fact, for most of us in this room, all the people in the groups we go to are glad we're all here together this weekend, right? They're happy. They are extremely happy that you're here. But I hate to break it to everyone, but there are people in other fellowships who are just as passionate about their fellowship as we are about ours. There are people in other fellowships who embrace their program of action just as much as we embrace ours. There are even people in other fellowships, believe it or not, who talk about in their fellowship, people being in the fellowship but not in the program. Like if we think we've cornered the market, we have not. Today's day and age, I've told you, don't kick people out of AA. Welcome them. Give them a bad cup of coffee in an uncomfortable chair. Let them have the time to decide. However, in 2023, if you don't have the phone numbers in your phone of people in your community and the other fellowships, get those numbers. Know who the equal of you is in NA or HA or CA or GA. Know who those people are. Don't just kick somebody out of a meeting. Take them to one of those fellowships. The last thing I'll say in Tradition 3, because it's not talked about enough. The outside world's view of our problem is not the same as our view. And that's okay. I'm not here to debate with medical and scientists and doctors, and I'm not here to debate with them. But they are out there telling everybody, like that person in the new doctor's opinion, that everything is the same. That doctor got on that Zoom thing and said that me, I'm pointing the finger at me. He said, I'm codependent. I have food issues. I'm a gambling addict. I'm a sex addict. I'm a drug addict, and I'm an alcoholic. He said, if you have one of those, you're all the same. That's not my experience. I'm also someone who has spent some time in service in another fellowship. So I have met many heroin addicts who tell me they're not an alcoholic, much like I would say that I'm not a drug addict. That doesn't mean I can use drugs. Drugs would lead me to making me make a bad decision, like picking up a drink. Non-alcoholic heroin addicts have told me they don't drink because drinking would lead them to make a dumb decision, like using heroin. However, if you go on the HA website, Heroin Anonymous World Services, they have their own grapevine. It's called The Main Line. You can read it right online. And you read the stories of how many of these men and women were dying in other fellowships until they got to HA and got identification. Like I said, I'm not about kicking anyone out, but we have to get to identification. The big book is really 104 pages. I hate to break it to the 164 crowd, but it's really not. From the doctor's opinion up until the end of the steps and working with others, it's about 104 pages in the current 4th edition. Half of that is about identification. Half of that 103 pages. That's how important getting to the Me Too moment is. And I'm in Akron, so I'll tell this story. I'm guessing a lot of people in here have seen all the movies, right? All the AA movies. Most of you. It's okay. I myself have a newcomer in my home group. He stayed up all night, watched it like 3 times in a row, and came to my meeting, an AA history expert, the next morning. My name is Bill W. is on TV, so he watched it 3 times in a row. And listen, I'm an Al-Anon kid, right? My mom was Al-Anon. I'm not one of those people who have the story, the worst thing in the world is a belly full of booze and a head full of AA. I'm the other. My story is there's nothing worse than a belly full of booze and my mother's head full of Al-Anon. That's my story. And that part in that movie, the Al-Anons love it. They can't get enough of it, actually. Bill in Brooklyn, in the kitchen. I haven't helped anybody. Bill W., the worst 12-stepper in the history of 12-stepping. A 0 batting average between December of 34 and May of 35. 0. He tells Lois that, Al-Anonic answer. What does she say? Oh, but you're sober, Bill. I don't care about those other people. You're sober. It's all that matters. Well, if it stayed like that, none of us are here today. Bill and Lois live their happy life. He continues to be a chronic failure. None of us ever celebrate this. Thank God he told Dr. Silkworth that before he came to Akron. You can't find that story in the big book, but it is in AA Comes of Age. Except, thank God, Dr. Silkworth didn't say, who cares, you're sober. No, Dr. Silkworth worked with thousands of hopeless alcoholics. He was interested in what happened to Bill. He wanted that to go to someone else. So he said to Bill, maybe the most important question ever asked in AA. What was your approach with these people? And Bill explained his approach, and Dr. Silkworth basically said, that approach sucks. You cannot tell a drunk that you were in a hospital bed at 3 a.m. and God used the wind to blow the windows open and you felt like you were floating on a cloud in a mountain, like it's never gonna work. No drunk wants to hear any kind of crazy story like that. You have to stick to the medical estimate of alcoholism. You have to stick to the allergy and the mental obsession. And Dr. Bob many times asked why he gave that guy from New York more time than he originally thought. Dr. Bob always said to anybody that asked him that question, it's because he was the first person that described his drinking, not mine. And what he described happens to him, happens to me. Not in the parking lot, how many DWIs do you have, how much child support do you owe, how many jobs have been fired from. No, those are things that happen, but the medical estimate of alcoholism. So let's talk about the fourth tradition quickly. Because again, I told you, I'm going to stick to the ones that are important in today's world in the short time I have. Just know this rule. Anytime you hear someone quote the fourth tradition, they are about to run over like 5 other traditions at the same time. Okay? The fourth tradition is not veto power. It has no veto power over any of the other 12 or 11 traditions. Each of the 12 traditions stands on its own. And you or I or our groups don't have the permission or the authority to change any of the 12 traditions. If that were to happen, 75% of the groups in AA would have to vote on that. But until that happens, the other 11 remain. You don't get to say we've taken our fourth tradition, autonomy, and we're not observing this other tradition. That's not how it goes. I would point out that autonomy or autonomous is not even in the long form of the fourth tradition. It's the only thing we focus on in the short tradition. But it's not veto power. I say this, and I wanted to make sure I talked about this because I believe it's going to get worse. And I already thought it wouldn't get worse than it did, and then the 2016 presidential election happened. And I say this with a big disclaimer. I don't care who you vote for. I don't care what your politics are. It's none of my business. But when a new person comes into my group and they sit next to me, if I want to honor the third tradition, I have to honor the 10th as well. It does not matter if they're straight, gay, bi, or trans. It does not matter if they're Christian, Jew, Muslim, or non-believer. It does not matter what color or race or nationality they are. And as I always say, it doesn't even matter if they're a Boston Red Sox fan. My job is to extend the hand of Alcoholics Anonymous to them. Period. People know I say this too because I'm a huge Metallica fan, but nothing else matters. Nothing else matters. So we're about to get into another election season here. We need to keep that nonsense outside of Alcoholics Anonymous. We do. And that means out of the parking lots. And that means the virtual parking lots before the chairperson starts the Zoom meeting. I don't need to hear about vaccine or no vaccine before this meeting starts. I don't need to see your pin or your shirt or your hat as to who you're voting for. Now, I'll be perfectly honest. Life gets busy. If you told me that you dropped your 7-year-old off at baseball and your 5-year-old daughter off at cheerleading, and you went home and you tried to make dinner quickly because you're trying to keep this sober life going, and you ran out to a meeting and you forgot you had a pin or a hat on, I'd be like, who cares? But if you're the person who every meeting you go to, you need to wear some pin or hat or badge to tell me who you voted for or who I should vote for, stay away. Leave the newcomer alone. I was at my home group during the last election cycle. Unfortunately, the day after one of the debates, an old-timer. You know, we love to blame newcomers for our problems in AA. Let's just get that out of the way. It's not newcomers, okay? It's all bad behavior by somebody with double-digit sobriety that they have passed on to other people, okay? But this person with 3 decades of double-digit sobriety went on a rampage about the debate the night before. Went on a rampage about how he could not believe how ungodly the world. I sat there, I could not believe it. About 4 chairs later, a woman raised her hand and said, we don't talk about that stuff here. She said, we don't do that in AA. Then there were a couple other shares, but what really troubles me about that day is that a young gay man with about a week, 6 or 7 days, came back to the group of people who had spoken up and said, you know, I really want to thank you for saying that, because I didn't think I belonged here. I thought maybe I wasn't welcome. Like religion, politics, sectarian reform, that's the red blinking stop sign. That's the definition of the red blinking stop sign. It all should be out. I'm glad if the Recovery Bible helped you. I am. I truly am. Outside of AA. I really am. But I don't need to hear, you know, the problem with alcoholics, again, it goes back to the kind of people we are. I'm sure I'll describe this, and some of you have had the same situation. We just don't know how to do anything halfway, right? I kind of laugh when it says half measures. You ever run into an alcoholic who's found something new? Like, let me give you some examples. The CrossFit alcoholic, okay? Any of you been in a meeting where someone is in CrossFit lately and thinks that your spirituality would be at a new level if you also got into CrossFit? Then let's go to the yoga alcoholic, okay? If you really want to put your spirituality on steroids, you need to jump into yoga, right? And back in the day, it was ESP and the Landmark Forum and God knows everything else. It all needs to stay out. We don't have a lot to offer here. We have a spiritual experience to offer. But our number one job is the newcomer. You know, somebody will say something and then somebody else says, oh, don't worry, they know what you really meant. Yes, I know what you really meant. But unfortunately, the newcomer with 4 days, they don't. They have no idea. So when they ask, are there any AA-related announcements? And you make an announcement that the recovery house down the street's having a fishing trip, the newcomer thinks that's AA. I know it's not AA. You know it's not AA. But the newcomer thinks it is. I don't care what industry you work in. I don't care if you work in the insurance industry. I do. I don't care if you work in the treatment industry. I don't care if you're a life coach or a sober coach. I don't care if you are a lawyer. When you enter the AA parking lot, yeah, throw your business cards away or leave them in the car. Don't use AA as advertising ground. Now people say, isn't that a little extreme? No, it's not extreme. I have a whole file of sober coaches and life coaches of people who have sent me pictures of the cards that were handed out in meetings. We don't use AA for opportunity to make ourselves more money. That doesn't mean the treatment industry is bad or the recovery industry is bad. It means it's outside. All industries are outside. But sometimes now listen, if you go to the same meeting every week and you know that the guy at the end of the table is a mechanic, great, because you met him, you know him, and you had a flat tire, that's awesome. That's a lot different than using the rooms of AA as a marketing scheme. Those have no business there. Now, I'll close with a couple of minutes just talking about anonymity, because I started off talking about anonymity. Sometimes we think we only have 11 traditions, not 12. 12th tradition, anonymity, is probably more important than 11th. The 11th tradition is really our public relations policy, not our anonymity tradition. That's our public relations policy at the level of press, radio, and film about my last name and my face and those things. But not, the 12th tradition is about humility. The 12th tradition, I believe the greatest thing ever written about it was by a non-alcoholic, believe it or not. It breaks my heart to say that. But I think he beat us all. I'm just going to find it very quickly for you. But some of you have probably read the service manual, and some of you have probably read Why We Need a Conference, and he's most famous for what he said for that, Bernard Smith. Without Bernard Smith, a lot of AA would not be here today, but this is what he said about anonymity. Let us talk about the concept of anonymity. I can remember when the reason for the name Alcoholics Anonymous was based on the fear of human beings having to admit to the world that they had once been afflicted with alcoholism. Yet within a relatively short space of time, the word anonymity as a device to hide one's past as an alcoholic has disappeared. I know of no alcoholic in AA who are today not proud of their affiliation with the society. The concept of anonymity really means, to all of us, the humility and the willingness to serve without hope of gain or recognition or reward. If only all of human society could accept this concept of humility as we practice it in serving humanity. No gain of recognition of reward. You know, you could be the greatest chairperson in the history of your group. Thanks for your service. You could be the greatest cookie person in the history of your world or group. Thanks for your service. But if you really want to embrace the traditions, you want to root for whoever replaces you in a service position to actually be better than you were. If I want to put my money where my mouth is, I hope somebody's a better delegate than I ever was. If I want to put my money where my mouth is, I hope somebody's a better trustee than I ever was. But we get so consumed with fear and everything else that we want to tear everything down, because maybe my recognition and my reward won't be as good anymore. And that has to just go away. At the end of the day, we have to remember what we're protecting. We have to. AA, the Spiritual Society of Alcoholics Anonymous, has only been here since June 10th of 1935. Mother's Day 1935 is when those two men met. it is almost impossible to believe that it stayed together as much as we tried to destroy it. The Washingtonians destroyed themselves. The Women's Christian Temperance Union went off to the side as well. The Oxford Group. It is super important. People say, Billy, why are the traditions so important? Because I'm not. You're not. What has to be in 100 years? 100 years from now in Akron, on this weekend, has to be Founders Day. Has to be Dr. Bob's house sitting there. Has to be a whole bunch of volunteers who don't remember any of our names and are doing the same thing to protect Alcoholics Anonymous. And why do we need to protect it? And some people have heard me say this before. I'll tell you why we need to protect it. Because in the history of the world, our importance as an organization is hard to even wrap your hands around. So if you don't know this story, some of you do, but I'll share it with the others that don't. In 1998, Time magazine knew that two things would happen in 2 years. They knew that Time magazine would turn 80 years old. And they knew that one century would end and another century would start. If you worked in the corporate world at that time, you heard about this crazy thing called Y2K. The world was going to end. If you're too young to know about it, basically meant all the computers in the world was going to end and nothing happened. But Time magazine knew that at least those two things would happen. And so they hired a committee of the smartest academic historians in the world, all around the world. And nothing against, like, I'm sure if I went to Dr. Bob's house today, which I might stop by there, I'm sure at one time I could pick out wow, there's like 4 great AA historians and archivists here. I'd name a couple, but then the others get mad, so I'm not going to name any, right? But Time magazine didn't ask any AA historians or archivists. They went to the greatest universities in the world for the greatest history professors in the world. They gave them one assignment. Start on January the 1st of 1900 and go all the way up to today. And we need you to identify the 80 most important days of the 20th century. You can order that book today if you want, 80 Days to Change the World. Google it, whatever. If you go to my house and you open it up and you go about 15 pages into the section on the 1930s, you'll come on a picture of our co-founders. You'll see on June 10th of 1935 in a small town called Akron, Ohio, the birth of Alcoholics Anonymous took place. When a broken stockbroker met with a broken surgeon in the birth of Alcoholics Anonymous. Not only have saved millions of lives, but have shared their solution with people who have other problems. And then if you go a few pages before or a few pages after, what are they comparing that to? Oh, Jackie Robinson, on this day, he was the first black player in history of Major League Baseball. Oh, on this day, Martin Luther King gave the I Have a Dream speech. Oh, on this day, women got the right to vote. Oh, on this day, Harvey Milk gave a speech. On this day, the wall came down in Berlin. Like the smartest academics in the world included AA on that list. And so I can't preach about the traditions or force you to do through the traditions, or I can't take you through the big book from a podium. It's crazy talk. You got to do that one-on-one. Same with the traditions. But what are we protecting? One of the 80 greatest days of the 20th century. You think anybody, nothing against Akron, did anybody wake up on Mother's Day of 1935 thinking, you know what? In like 70 years, Time magazine is going to write a book about the 80 greatest days in the history of the world. And one of them is going to take place right here in Akron, Ohio. No, nobody thought that. Nobody thought that. I don't need to steal the book for you or ruin the surprise, but when you do get that book, make a checklist of how many of those days happen in the United States versus the rest of the world. And then think to yourself, wow, if you asked people in 1935 that in 70 years Time magazine was going to write a book and it was going to be the 80 greatest days in the history of the world, and we need you to guess how many are going to be in the United States versus the rest of the world. Put all your chips in the middle of the table when that book comes out in 70 years, and then ask them, out of the few that are in the United States, how much money are you putting down that Ohio is definitely in? Ohio definitely wins. Ohio has one of the 80 greatest days in the history of the 20th century. That's what we're protecting. That's why Alcoholics Anonymous is so important. That's why the traditions are so important. Not to be the police, not to make sure that AA is still here. Now, if you have one home group, maybe you have more, I'm not going to judge. I am going to say this about the seventh tradition. Take care of your own home group before you put money in every other basket. The long form is clear. Every AA group is supported by the voluntary contributions of its members. Don't think you'll be shamed if you don't put money in other baskets. And I'm not telling you not to put money in other baskets. I'm telling you, make sure your home group is taken care of first. I'm telling you that we get ourselves in trouble in service in AA everywhere when we depend on anything else but contributions. When we start worrying about dances and this and that, we survive by the contributions of our members. I think I have 4 minutes. Where's the taper? Do I have 4 or 5 minutes? 5? Gotcha. Okay. The traditions allowed people up until 1981 to put money in a basket. That money in the basket paid for their expenses and kept AA going. And then some of those groups sent money to their local intergroup or to their district or to their area or whatever. And then in 1983, in June, a young Marine named Jay, he sent a letter from a place called Beirut saying, hey, I got no literature here and it sucks. And so the lady from GSO mailed him a letter, a big book, said, hey, Jay. Jay wrote back a month later, said, thank you for the book. I need more literature. He's no different than us. The lady at GSO sent him another letter and more literature. Jay wrote back again, said, hey, he used Bill's words, I have good news to report. I started a group here called the Peacekeepers Group. Marines, local people, Navy. But now I really need more literature. Please send me more. And this went back and forth until I didn't hear from Jay for a couple of months. And I close with this. Jay, I never met him. I never knew him. He is one of my ultimate heroes in Alcoholics Anonymous. Some young kid Marine who just needed literature. Because that letter that came in December of 1983 from that other group member who said that they had the heartbreaking job of telling the lady at GSO that the young Marine they had been writing to had been killed in the barracks blast of October of 1983. But wanted them to know the group was still going. And when you leave here today, When you leave here today, just Google AA in Lebanon. And you'll see on Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturday nights at 8:30, because some young kid who was in the Marines who got sober before he went away, who needed literature, needed a book, wrote a letter. And because we put money in a basket, there was somebody who was able to send him a letter and write him a letter and send him literature. That's what we're here to protect. We're not here to protect big fancy AA. I love big fancy AA, but it's not what we're here to protect. We're here to protect Jay. We're here to protect that another meeting like Bill and Bob happen. We need to guarantee that Founders Day in 100 years, even though I'm selfish and I'm not happy I won't be around. And guess what? The person who presents on the traditions in 100 years will do a much better job than me, and that's how it's supposed to be. Thank you.